I can say what that means.
Well, we're glad to have you, so you can go right into your presentation.
Thanks so much, Lee. Appreciate the chance to be here today. So again, I'm Jack Irvin, Senior Director of State National Policy. In short, I'm a lobbyist. I'm a federal and state lobbyist. So you read about all these special interests out there. I'm proudly one of them. And my special interest is farmers. So we're a general farm organization at Farm Bureau. We're headquartered here in Columbus, Ohio, where I am. And have members, tens of thousands of members all across the state. And then we're part of a national federation with American Farm Bureau and have millions of members across the country. And kind of at its core, we're an advocacy organization. And for me, as a lobbyist, I go advocate on behalf of our members. So whether you're talking, kind of general business items like tax policy or workers' comp, or kind of broader market-specific issues like trade or farm programs at the federal level. So kind of take care of everything. I'm going to do my best here to try to share my screen here today with you guys and just have a little bit of a PowerPoint. So I'm going to kind of highlight where some of the impacts that we've seen from COVID specifically and how that has affected agriculture community. So some of this is going to be Ohio specific, and some of it's kind of the broader perspective from the nation and internationally. So let's try to share my screen here first. See if I can do that. Can you all see the slide?
Coming through real well.
All right, very good. Joys of technology when it works, right? But so often it doesn't do what you want it to do. So just wanted to highlight, so when we're talking about, COVID and business impacts, of course, you kind of have to look at that bigger, broader picture as well for across the country. I don't think this is a slide that will surprise too many people at all, but this is general employment numbers for the entire U.S. This is not specific to just agriculture, but clearly we've been on a very steady job addition track for quite some time. And as you know, we just hit a cliff there, right? Just tens of millions of jobs have been lost, and we're starting to bring that back. This is only up through June, but certainly we have a long way to go. And there's no doubt about it. Like any industry, you have this type of big disruption across the economy. It's going to have impacts on agriculture, and we certainly have seen that. Unfortunately for agriculture, it's been a bit of a tough go for quite some time. So even pre-pandemic, we are kind of in the midst of nearly completing our 8th year of what we would call a down economy, and how we look at that is just simply net cash income that's coming onto the farm. And so this would rival some of the longer downturns we've had, post World War II. Some of the financial crisis issues we had in the 80s was very difficult for agriculture. So overall, there's been some pretty difficult times. Now, as you guys know, within any industry, it depends, right? You have certain segments that have done really well, and some folks have really struggled. It just kind of depends where you are. I think this is a good way to kind of highlight the general health of the farm industry and some concerns that we are seeing. You kind of look at that debt to asset type ratio. How you doing on your real estate debt? How you doing on your non-real estate debt? And unfortunately, we've seen some pretty significant growth in that. And if you're looking at, inflation adjusted dollars, we've had some near record increases on that side of it. So unfortunately, that's been a challenge. One thing that has been very beneficial up until recently, obviously the economy as a whole has been very strong. And one thing to keep in mind for a lot of farmers, a lot of agriculture, they have some type of other business or some kind of other enterprise off the farm. And frankly, I think a lot of the strength on that side of the economy has benefited agriculture as a whole and helped them float some of this debt and you know, I don't call farming as a hobby, but some of our folks, you know, they'll laugh with you and say, oh yeah, I work at a, you know, X manufacturer in town so I can maintain my farming hobby. You know, obviously they're just joking with that, but kind of from the financial standpoint, that's what they're talking about. Some huge disruptions, as you guys know, from COVID here. One of the things that we saw was just a huge jump in increase. So this is looking at from May of 2019 and comparing that to May of 2020. What are some of the changes we saw? And certainly just saw some very big changes in purchases at that grocery store level that we had not seen in quite some time. One of the other big changes we saw was on the processing side. So you guys probably read a lot of stories about shortages of beef or some of the changes in that. And, you know, you've seen shopping some pretty strong prices at Kroger or Giant Eagle here in my area, Meijer, etc., as on the retail side. So you're probably wondering, gosh, I've seen some really strong prices on the retail side. Why is that not trickling down more to the farmer level? And this slide, I think, kind of helps highlight that. So one of the things you got to keep in mind, and I'll get to some slides later, roughly half of the dollars, more than half the dollars that we spend as consumers on our food does not go through kind of that retail level. It goes through restaurants, it goes through schools, conferences, etc. So overnight, when you had disruptions to half of your market like that, a lot of the industry, frankly, just wasn't geared up. So we saw huge increases in some of the demand, as you saw on that previous slide, for food products. But the supply chain can't just flip a switch, right? So if you're a restaurant, you might be purchasing eggs and packages of dozens and dozens and dozens, or you might be buying chicken wings by multiple pounds, where we as consumers at the grocery store, we don't want that, right? I want, you know, a boneless chicken breast, or I want a dozen eggs. So just like the logistics and the processing of that, we just frankly weren't able to flip that switch overnight. And that's why you saw some of the challenges you did on maybe some limits of meat purchases or maybe some limits on dairy purchases. Trust me, there was plenty of food supply there coming from the farm side of things. It was more on that bottleneck of getting it in the process, the packages that we as consumers wanted, and having that availability. You know, if Kroger's running X number of trucks a day or a week, you know, obviously you're seeing a 20, 25, 30% foot traffic increase. That's going to really disrupt some of your models of how you've historically done things. So this slide here just shows you there was a huge increase in that packer margin. That was not going down to the farmer. There was a lot of animals. There was a big bottleneck in trying to get animals processed. And unfortunately, some of those dollars were not going to the farm. So again, going back to that, where does our food dollar go? So 54%, this is from 2018, 54% of where we spend our food was away from the home. So you're talking restaurants, you know, other type stuff like that. Certainly just has a huge impact in where we spend our dollars. So we spend a lot of money on food. Again, just some pretty significant disruptions, right? Half of our food. So we saw our milk. Why was milk being an issue? So think about, you saw farmers dumping some milk. Think about all the little milk cartons our kids drink every day in school. So overnight, we don't need all that milk. We don't need all those milk cartons. We need half gallons. We need gallons. There's only so much shelf space that's out there. It was just such a challenge to try to get product. So one of the things that we worked on is frankly work with some of the retailers and like, hey, please stop limiting milk purchases. There is so much milk, we're literally dumping it on the ground because pandemic or not, that cow that was there before the pandemic still needs to be milked. that animal, that beef cattle that's out in the pasture is still getting fed, right? So those things don't stop. And that is something that we were focused on, trying to help smooth those disruptions as best we can. But unfortunately, it's had a pretty big impact. And think about how many farms just sell directly to the restaurant or directly to that retailer. That market just wasn't there. So trying to find different ways and being creative and how to we're still raising the same amount of food, but where and how it needs to go is totally different. So how do we adjust? And that was a big challenge. You know, one thing that I personally have been proud of, you've seen, you know, going to the grocery store, we struggled finding toilet paper, which I think is something that we're always going to think about no matter where we go after this pandemic. I think toilet paper is always going to be one of those things that, why was that such a bottleneck? You can't find hand sanitizer. But for the most part, you know, we've had one of the largest pandemics that the world has seen, certainly in my lifetime. I'm 42, but for many decades. And other than maybe you couldn't buy some of the select cuts of meat you wanted, or maybe you lost some bread opportunities, or maybe didn't quite have as much milk that you wanted to purchase, for the most part, there was no issues with our food supply in terms of people having access to food and affordable food. And I think that's just an incredible testament to our farmers, because they didn't stop working, they kept going. But early on, in some of the discussions, whether it was with the Homeland Security or here in Ohio, you know, as you guys know, when we're looking at that lockdown scenario, they were outlining what are our essential businesses. And I think pretty similar or pretty early was people recognize, hey, a grocery store is essential. We got to have that be in place. It's got to stay open. But it wasn't real clear in some of these early draft orders up that supply chain, right? How does that food get to the grocery store? And that's something that we worked hard very much at Farm Bureau, making sure, hey, crops, the weather only cooperates at this time. It doesn't matter if there's a pandemic, we've got to plant during this time, or these animals have to get to market during this time. They're at the right size. We don't have any other choice. So we worked to make sure that agriculture and up that supply chain was considered essential, so that if you were, you know, planting corn and soybeans this spring, you had access to the fertilizer you needed, you had access to the seed you needed, and just making sure all those products that, frankly, even for me, take for granted sometime, that our farmers were able to operate. Our farm markets, for example, let them be treated like grocery store. So much of our product gets sold directly to the consumer from the farm. Why couldn't an outdoor, you know, small farm stand be considered the same as like Walmart? And so we just made sure that people had the ability to sell and move forward with that. On the meat side, again, I talked about that this was a challenge. You don't think about it, but every animal that gets processed, whether it's here at the state or at the national level, it has to be inspected. And so if you are processing animals for market that's going to be sold out to the consumer, those are getting inspected. And you cannot sell if they're not. You cannot be processing animals if you don't have inspectors, whether it's from the U.S. Department of Agriculture or Ohio Department of Agriculture. So we wanted to make sure we had access to that. Unfortunately, it's a very labor-intensive business, and we saw some issues with processors nationally that they had to either slow down their lines because they had to spread people out, or they had illnesses themselves with some of their workers, so they had to shutter their plants or idle their plants. And so that's where you started seeing some of the concern of, we just didn't have the capacity to move that. So we were working, hey, how can we make sure that these plants can operate safely, make sure they have the resources, whether it's personal protection equipment for their workers, testing, et cetera, to make sure that we can keep that food supply working and moving. Here's again an example of just that huge disruption of where we spend our money. So that blue line, that's kind of out, the food that we spend out at bars and restaurants, et cetera. And then that red line was a grocery store. You see that huge divergence there, and kind of back in that May time period. And then we're starting to see some adjustments in that now. I talked about the massive changes on the slaughtering side. So this is just based off of percentages, so it doesn't really give you a clear picture. But let's talk about the hog here slide on the right. For example, right before we came into the pandemic across the United States, we were processing almost 3 million hogs a week. So it's hard to imagine that kind of volume in my mind, but we eat a lot of food, and we're processing 3 million hogs a week. In just a matter of a few weeks, we lost almost a capacity by almost 1 million hogs. So think about all those farmers that are out there raising animals that they got to do something with them. They got to go to market. They're at a certain weight. It's not healthy to keep the animal. It's costly. There's so many different reasons why they need to go. What do you do when you've lost 1 million hog capacity a week? So that was, again, part of some of the changes. Same thing on the poultry side. Just, again, some very, very major changes. Of course, on the poultry side, chicken, we're processing millions and millions and millions of birds a week, delivering millions of eggs a week, and just had some huge disruptions on that supply chain. We saw some pretty significant changes in prices. So as I talked about, on the hog side, you lost a million hogs a week in terms of capacity. Well, those animals are still there. So we saw almost a 45% drop in hog prices, and it was just like that. That makes it extremely challenging for farmers, and frankly, it was difficult for a lot of us to understand. We saw how limited the supplies were at the grocery store. We saw their prices were very strong. We knew we had the animals, but it just wasn't trickling down on the farm level. So I think that's something broader that at least Farm Bureau is certainly looking at. Maybe one of the weaknesses in our food supply is that the processing side, can we get maybe a little bit more diversity in that? For example, 80% of the beef that gets processed in this country, there's only 4 companies that do that. Now, it's more than 4 plants. They're kind of scattered across the United States, but it's 4 companies that process about 80% of the beef. And again, we're talking, hundreds of thousands of cows a week. So is there a way to maybe have some more regionalization, have some more diversity on that side? So I've ran through a lot of really negative slides and some really the struggles that we've had. But what are some of the positives that we have seen? Certainly on the livestock side, particularly, we've seen some positive. Trade is an issue that is vitally important to agriculture. And China, I'm just going to lift up one trading partner here, vitally important to agriculture, U.S. agriculture particularly. At any given year, between 20 and 25% of all the agricultural products in the U.S. get exported. We're one of the few industries that has a trade surplus. And certainly trade with China has been a big part of that. And a number of years ago, within the last year, they've been struggling with what was called the African swine fever, and they've lost hundreds of millions of hogs. This is wild to think about. Obviously, China has a very populous country. They eat a lot of pork. In any given year, China has more hogs raised in their country than the rest of the world combined. So think about that. Think about how much pork we eat here in America. I just said we were slaughtering 3 million hogs a week, and those are almost all raised here in the United States. Just China, the rest of the world combined, historically, they raise more hogs than the rest of the world. It's pretty wild to think about. So they need a lot of product. They would buy a lot of our soybeans to feed those animals. Unfortunately, as I talked about with some of the swine fever issues, they haven't had hogs to feed. So they've been buying a lot more U.S. pork, which has been a very positive trend that we've seen. So again, on the livestock meats, on the poultry side, we're seeing some pretty positive signs on the dairy side in terms of some of our trade with China. And then one other very positive aspect, so the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement. Many of you would probably know this as the new NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is between us, Canada, and Mexico. For just agricultural products and just from the U.S., those two countries on any given year, we send $40 billion a year in agricultural products to those two countries. With this new deal, they've created some opportunities on the dairy side, on the poultry side, remove some barriers that were in place that hopefully will give us some opportunity to continue to grow that a couple more $1 billion. So since NAFTA went in effect in the 90s, agricultural exports to those two countries have quadrupled. So it's been a very beneficial thing for us, and it's something that we spend a lot of time on is trade and market development, because as I said earlier, between 20 and 25% of all agricultural products go overseas. And if you're talking like a product like soybeans here in the United States, on average, if you're driving around in your area and you see a soybean field, on average, every other row of soybeans that you would drive by gets exported outside the US. And historically, China was buying every third row. So trade is just huge to who we are and what we do, particularly those of you down there in Southwest Ohio here. It's kind of wild to think about, but a lot of our grain gets loaded up down there in Cincinnati on the Ohio River, goes down the Mississippi River, and goes to places like Japan or China. And it's just kind of crazy for me to think about here. You know, our neighbors here in Ohio are sending product all over the world and using our inland waterway system. So I think one of the other positive things that frankly for me living here in the city, again, even though I work with farmers, I work for the a farm organization, I honestly don't worry or think all that much about my food supply. I don't worry about it too much, if I'm being brutally honest with myself. And I know a lot of my friends and neighbors do not. And I think for the first time in so many of our lifetime, this is one of the few times I think people have actually stopped and think a little bit, hey, where does our food come from? How does Kroger get those shelves stocked? How does Giant Eagle get their food? And I think from a positive note, and I'm proud to say it's put a spotlight on a lot of our farmers, a lot of my members, and just shows the amazing work and the blessings that we do have here in the U.S. of kind of no matter what's going on, no matter what craziness is happening in the world, we still have stocked shelves and full bellies for the most part. Obviously, we have some food insecurity issues, but it's not from a lack of access to food. It might be more of an affordability issue for the most part. So that's all I got, and happy to answer any questions, Lee. And just thank you for the opportunity here this morning.